Okay, I guess it's just about time to start, colleagues. Welcome to this afternoon panel discussion, which is a part of the ICRI conference. We are discussing in very general terms the societal impact of research infrastructures. We have tackled several issues already in the morning parallel sessions, and today, with the help of very distinguished speakers, I don't know where the names are gone, we will tackle the next important topic, which is to understand to which extent we can help science and society to develop a strategic approach towards research infrastructure investment. So the question which stands in top of this panel in general is, how do we know that we are investing in the right things? And the discussion shall tackle different aspects of this question. So we have, as said, 5 distinct speakers. You are supposed to see their names on the screen. I hope it will be recovered with the help of the technical staff here, but without any ado, I am now inviting a colleague and good friend of mine, Alasdair Reid, who is the director of the EFIS Center in Belgium, and he is spending his life among different things in advising policymakers and sometimes even politicians on strategic investments. Alasdair, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks very much, Jan. It's fantastic to be here. A very nice room with the sun coming in, which is nice as well, because usually we're in dark rooms without any windows in these sorts of events. I think I've got 10 minutes or 12 minutes. Jan will wave to me when time is up, but I'll try and keep to time. I've got a set of slides. I won't talk to them all. I think some of the text will be too small for those of you sitting way at the back, and maybe some of them in the middle, but the presentation will be available after. And I'm going to talk about a report we've just finished, which is available from various websites of the European Commission, so you can go and look at the details on that slide, on that report. Let me see if I get the buttons right. Yeah. Okay. So we're talking today about how to, understand where to make the right investments, and also once we've made those investments, to understand how we optimize and sustain the investments in research infrastructures. And I think what we've seen over the last, maybe not a decade, but certainly the last 5-6 years, is an increasing focus on not only the impact of research infrastructures on research excellence, which is, of course, their first and primary mission, but also on society, economy, understanding of science in our populations, and so on. So I think the focus and understanding of what we expect from research infrastructures has been changing. I think there's also an understanding that when we make strategic investments in research infrastructures, whether they're single-sited, distributed, etc., virtual, that we've also been hearing about in the last day or so, that we're trying to make sure that there's not only investment in equipment, but also investment in the people that go along with it, and indeed investment in building up research and innovation communities and ecosystems around those research infrastructures. And at least in the European environment, one of the key issues is to make sure that the national or regional investments that are going into research infrastructures from public budgets are aligned as much as possible, as coherently as possible, with what's being done at European level. And I think the need for synergies, it's a word we use a lot in Brussels, where I'm based. In the policy circles, it's sometimes overused, but it's critical to develop those synergies between national research infrastructures and European and international ones. So I think these are three topics I just wanted to introduce in my first slide. What I'm going to give you in the next 8 minutes or whatever left is an overview of a recent piece of work that we finished for the European Commission, a panel of experts under the Horizon Europe Policy Support Facility. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the 28 national research infrastructures that were funded in the last period, the 2014-20 period in Greece. So the investment into the infrastructures in Greece obviously was supported by the Greek government, but particularly also by the European structural investment funds, and was really done with a number of objectives in mind. The first was obviously to structure the national research capacities in different priority fields. And you can see here the 6 or so fields that were prioritized under the Smart Specialization Strategy for Greece for 2014-20. And a number of national research infrastructures were selected. One of the critical and I think important things that was identified here as a reason for this investment, when we're talking about why are we investing, how do we know we're trying to invest, was to try and not only build up the research capacities and research facilities in Greece, but also to attract and retain, particularly a major issue in Greece in terms of sort of brain drain and so on, was to retain the talented researchers, young people, technologists in Greece working in those facilities. So the investment was made with a double objective. One was structuring the research capacities, innovation capacities around these priority themes that were identified in the national strategy, but also very much to try and build up and retain the talent in the country. The details you can see there, but 28 national research infrastructures involving 213 organizations, so very distributed structure. Most of the Greek universities, the national research centers that were already existing, bringing together their capacities in different fields. Total budget of 93 million euros, so a significant investment over that period. What we did when we looked at it was we tried to understand what is this actually trying to achieve. Again, people at the back won't be able to read this. It wasn't the objective. We built up a theory of change to try and understand what was expected to come out of this investment over time, and in that way understand how we can also make that investment more sustainable in the future. Obviously, when you read the policy documents, the objective is to make the Greek economy more competitive, to increase research excellence, but in the short term, the immediate shorter-term objectives were to try, as I said, structure access to infrastructures and equipment in Greece. One of the big challenges, I think, if you look over the last 20 years in Greece, as an example of how European funding has been used in member states, is a lot of investments were going into individual projects, individual universities, individual research centres. And as one person we were talking to when we did the interview said to us, there's a lot of Ferraris in garages, at least in terms of scientific equipment, Ferraris in garages, not always with the person who knows how to drive them, owning the garage. So one of the things was, how do we open up access to all that equipment? How do we make the capacity available to not only the research base, but also industry and so on in the different sectors? So the theory of change we tried to build up was also about understanding what are the assumptions being made behind this investment for the long-term sustainability of these 28 national research infrastructures. What's Horizon Europe Policy Support Facility? It's an instrument of the European Commission, DG Research and Innovation. We started last year a new 4-year period. It provides support to member states. It also brings together in what are called mutual learning exercises, groups of member states around different topics. In this case, it was a request from the Greek authorities for the support to review their national research infrastructures. How did we do it? So we ran a survey. We have a panel of experts. I'll have a slide with their names at the end, but I won't bore you with that now. We had a group of experts, panel of experts appointed through the Policy Support Facility, who went into the country, looked at what was the evidence that was available. One of the key things we did, setting out to review the state of play of these infrastructures, which had about 3-4 years under that investment program to develop their capacities, develop their services, develop their facilities, run their procurements and so on, so all the stuff that has to be done to make sure the facilities are up and running. was to undertake a survey of the research infrastructures. That survey wasn't done just to inform us. We designed it as a form of self-assessment process for the national research infrastructure coordinators and the teams around each of the distributed research infrastructures. Obviously, we talked with the users as well. It's nice to talk to the coordinators. It's good to talk to users to understand whether this is actually having an impact on either research services, businesses, society, so public sector users as well of the research infrastructures. And then we had a number of workshops and events with the thematic groups that I mentioned just before, agri-food, energy, environment, and so on. At the end, we came out with a set of recommendations which looked at two issues. One is the criteria for optimizing future investments, and the other one is about trying to enhance the operational capacity of the research infrastructures. Again, you won't read this, but it's on the slides and you'll get it afterwards. But what we tried to do was, in terms of looking at the national research infrastructures, was to try and look at 6 key criteria. So I'm trying to answer some of the questions that we were asked to address in this session. We looked at 6 key criteria to understand the progress for the research infrastructures. Again, our job was not to evaluate each national research infrastructure, but was to try and have an overview of the portfolio of research infrastructures and understand where they were. So we developed what we call the traffic light grid, so relatively simple process with red, green, and orange. So the green, everything's good, orange could be better, and red, you might have some trouble there if you're going to want to get funded in the next period. And just to give you an idea of the sort of criteria we were looking at, one was obviously maturity of governance structures and management procedures. So these are distributed infrastructures. In the Greek system, this is around consortia. One of the key issues we discussed was how do we move from a consortium model to a legal entity in Greece that can then, for instance, participate to European projects as a single entity, can sell services or at least procure equipment or whatever as a single entity and not through individually each of the 10, 15, whatever it is, partners in each of the research infrastructures. Second key criteria, obviously, is the quality of user access policy. This is a huge issue. How are we making sure that having installed that equipment, people continue to have access in a way that's well managed, so in line with European regulations and so on, and access to research infrastructures. The strategic outlook, we had a long discussion with Jan, who was part of the peers working with us, and other colleagues from other countries who were working on the panel about what makes a national research infrastructure unique in the national context, but also particularly when it can be perhaps a flagship national research infrastructure and well connected at European level. A fourth key criteria for us was European or international collaboration, where we tried to understand to what extent the research infrastructures were already engaged in collaboration at European level or had the potential to be better engaged in the future. And I think one of the key learnings we got out of this exercise, and one I've already discussed with colleagues at ICRI, was that the national research infrastructure teams that were already part of ICRI landmarks or projects benefited greatly in terms of their capacity to develop procedures, have access policies that are in line with national European standards and so on. Obviously, the last two criteria, very important. One was impact on research excellence. We saw some of the new national research infrastructures really structuring the capacity of, for instance, synthetic biology in Greece, which there wasn't really an agenda or a policy community, has really been structured around the national research infrastructure over the last years. So this whole building of research excellence, training of researchers in the research infrastructures, young researchers is a second example of the research excellence. And then, obviously, impact on innovation. It's still early days. We were able to identify interesting examples where companies and other users were able to use the research infrastructure facilities to actually start developing new services or new products and so on. So we tried to set up this traffic light system. I won't bore you with the traffic light map, which is in the report. You can see how we assessed the different national research infrastructures. I think I've just run out of time, but I'll give you a few key takeaways from the review. I think one of the first things is that having some form of self-assessment framework in place for research infrastructures at national level, and obviously European level as well, is not only important for those of us who are on the policy or funding or evaluation side, but it is also critical for the national research infrastructure, or the research infrastructure managers and partners. It gives them a framework with which to assess their own progress towards a number of criteria, including the ones I listed there. The distributed research infrastructure model in the case of Greece has been really important. It's what a number of things it's done. One is it's opened up understanding. We talked to industry users who said, I knew about people in Athens or Patras, but I didn't know what was existing in other parts of the country. It's really given me a view of the full range of services, for instance, in plant technologies and agri-food, which we'll hear about in a minute or two from our Australian colleague. Another element was obviously the strengthening of communities of practice. One of the lesser points, or one of the points where we could see improvement was needed, was still on building up thematic data platforms, research data platforms, fair data, and so on. So that sort of cross-cutting support that could be provided to the national research infrastructures was something that we felt could be improved. The absence of support measures. So you launch 28 national research infrastructures and you don't have a kind of network support. You don't have support on training them and so on. This is something which we felt could be improved at the national level. Maybe, again, an interesting takeaway for other countries. And as I've mentioned, this link between the national level research infrastructures, your key infrastructures at national level, and ESRI is really about a sort of win-win process where the national partners can learn but can also bring their know-how to the European level. So I think it's something which is stated in strategies and so on, but which actually has to be operationalized if we want to make it as impactful as possible. I won't go through the criteria, but we also proposed, based on that, a number of criteria for the next period. And the last slide, I think, here, which I wanted just to quickly talk to before Jan cuts me off, is what we've proposed for the future. So we said, okay, now we've looked at all of this. We've said things have worked pretty well in most of the cases, but how do we go about then trying to increase the performance over time? And again, this idea of building in self-assessment at an earlier stage. We came in after almost the end of the period. We feel there's a need for a mid-term review, which should be as much based on their ongoing self-assessment, based on KPIs, key performance indicators, that they select as part of their bid for future funding. And we also suggested to introduce a sort of performance bonus element into the system where the research infrastructures who meet their performance targets or who get beyond them get additional funding during the second part of the process. So again, trying to think of a system that encourages different improvements over time. Jan, I think I've run out of time. The panel is here. You'll see the slides if you want later on. And if you want the information, there's also the report online. And I think I've kept more or less the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alastair. I mean, in fact, your time management was perfect. So thank you also for this. And I will invite you later to the stage. And I am sure we can clarify one or the other thing you have to cut out because of this time restriction. So, colleagues, the next very important expert on the stage is Silvia Vignetti, Director of the Department of Evaluation Development Unit in Italy. Silvia is, similarly to Alastair, supporting policy decisions, evaluations of research infrastructures, helping to create policies, helping to understand and optimize better the interactions between research and innovation, because she's also, if I understood that correctly, working on the interface between academia and industry. She has many things to say to us, therefore I'm cutting it short. Silvia, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for this introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in Brno, so I'm particularly grateful for this invitation. I'm taking some time because the presentation is not going, so I'm trying to, yes. Okay, so you will have... You get 1 minute more. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So, yeah, in the meantime, I can introduce the topic of the presentation. Yes, the key question of this session is how do we know that we invest in the right thing? This is the title. And more precisely, how we can build a quality assurance and review system into the investment selection process. Oh, something is happening here. Very good. So I will try again to launch the presentation. Okay, which is not starting. What I can offer to the discussion today is the point of view of an evaluator as I am. So what we typically do, we describe, we measure, we communicate impacts to the stakeholders, to the facility managers, to the funders, to the policymakers that have to select the right investment. So this is what we do. And I think that in doing so, we can contribute in laying a common playing field in the investment selection process in the conversation about socioeconomic impact. Okay. So, oh, here we are. Very good. Also for you now. Okay. Very good. So, I'm an economist as a background, so I have been involved in a number of impact assessment exercises. So I will describe today what I have learned about socioeconomic assessment at the service of research infrastructure strategic planning. So my main claim is that socioeconomic assessment can help answering the right questions that a quality assurance and review process should have. Right question being the good question or the relevant, the useful questions that may be asked when selecting research infrastructure. So there is a sort of, I would say rather wrong belief that you need to look back in the past when you talk about impacts, as if you would necessarily need to observe the change to say that it actually occurred. But looking forward is also a useful exercise because it comes at a moment when you still have the possibility to influence what is going to happen, and you can take action in order to maximize what you want to achieve. So in particular, if a socioeconomic impact assessment is carried out at an early phase of an infrastructure design, it can immediately feed into the strategic planning exercise and also the conceptual design of that facility. So this is precisely what the CIS team is doing in this moment in a context of a study that is carrying out together and on behalf of the CERN. The team, the CSIL team, is coordinated by my colleague Emanuela Sirtori, and what we are doing is assisting the CERN in this in the Future Circular Collider Innovation Study. So very briefly, the European Strategy for Particle Physics is the scientific deliberation process of Europe decision-making process for the long-term future in the field, in the particle physics field. So in the 2020 update of the strategy, it presented a vision for both near and long-term future, and in particular, it recommended to carry out a technical and financial feasibility study for a next-generation hadron collider in preparation for the long term. So the Future Circular Collider study explores different collider options, combined into a single research infrastructure built in a almost 100 kilometers underground tunnel, which can offer a solid and diverse physics program. So CSIL is contributing to this wide study in a work package on socioeconomic impact. So this is one of the most recent and comprehensive exercises, but my team carried out many other socioeconomic impact assessments. So what I'm saying today has a more general validity. I think we've been carrying out study for research infrastructures in different fields, including social science and humanities, for example. We've been collaborating with the ALBA synchrotron, so we have a relatively wide experience. So the first point, I mean, a rather unique aspect of this specific study is the fact that socioeconomic impact is built in since the very beginning of the study, as is in fact part of a wide exercise of assessing feasibility of this infrastructure under many different aspects. Research infrastructure generates a variety of socioeconomic benefits. So the first step is what we are doing, what we did is to map all the different type of benefits and the affected stakeholders beyond the scientific community, including students, the industry, policymakers, and even citizens. The pathways and the impacts that can be generated affect several domains in different ways, and also different geographical scope and width, so going from the global to the local. So we are trying to assist in the identification and then in the description of what the facility is generating. So one of the key concerns when a facility is under construction and when you have to select and decide which is the right investment to do is that how to maximize the impact that you expect and how to build consensus among the affected stakeholders and how to be more effective in reaching scientific and societal goals. So, for example, results of our study, we are supporting the CERN management staff in the dialogue and in the negotiation with the local stakeholders in the host states. And also from the side of the public engagement, it's very important to understand how what is going to be planned can increase the public engagement and how and the outreach to the society at large, and how the cultural impacts can be increased. So, for example, an exercise that we are carrying out is surveys to taxpayers in different countries. 2 surveys were already done for Switzerland and for France. We are having additional surveys for other member state countries, the US, Japan, Italy, and others, to see the preferences, the awareness of the citizens, of the taxpayers, and their preferences about the support of the facility. Building another important question is which technologies are needed, which are the areas. Are those technologies already available, or do they need to be developed still? Building and operating a new research infrastructure can be a scientific and technical ambitious endeavor. So knowledge and technological spillovers are significant impact on the industry that materializes already during the conceptual and the construction phase. So you do not need to wait for the infrastructure to be operated in order to see already impacts in terms of know-how and technological spillovers. So investigating how this pathway takes place, which are the technological areas, which is the scientific know-how that is required, is fundamental. So the CERN is working closely with the university and the industry in order to accelerate the transition from fundamental research to products, to the technologies that are needed. As I was mentioned, in many cases, this kind of facility requires advanced technology, so advanced that they are not yet ready in the market, and they have to be developed specifically for the purpose of the infrastructure. So one example here on how the CERN is addressing this is this EasyTrain project, which is a new funded Marie Curie training network that aims at building a network of academic and industrial partners to advance the superconducting technologies and their applications. So it's already building the capacity and the possibility for the impact in terms of technological and know-how spillovers to be maximized. The skills and the competence are one very important ingredient, of course, in the socioeconomic impact that can be generated by a research infrastructure. So building and operating the infrastructure requires skills and competencies at the frontier of knowledge. So what we are doing in this moment is working with the management staff to identify the types of jobs and categories that are needed. In terms of how many and which kind of scientists, technicians, engineers, administration, students, postdoc, and how this, what kind of implication this has in terms of human resource management plan, for example. So where they will be hosted, where they will be located, how you can make this huge community work in the site where the facility will be constructed. So there is a lot of planning effort to imagine the implications that having such a high number of new people work their needs. Last but not least, the aspects of the cost projections So estimating the spending profile over time, and we're talking about a very long time horizons in many cases, helps secure the adequate sources of financing along the project development, and even trying to anticipate the possible risk that may occur and trying to mitigate it in advance. So think, for example, now the problem of the escalation of the energy costs. So the implication of this in terms of financial sustainability in the long term must be taken under close attention so that things can be solved sufficiently in advance. The financial aspects are not trivial. I mean, the cost estimation is challenging per se. This is the reason why the ICRI Forum has asked us a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, to develop these guidelines on cost estimation of research infrastructure. So since they are operating in international collaboration and they may use in-kind contributions, they span over a long time horizon. Estimating the costs pose some problems of harmonization and standardization of accounting rules. So what we have provided with these very short and concise guidelines is some recommendations on how this can be done in a robust and solid way, which is something that is found to be a challenge in some research infrastructures. So I want to have just 1 minute left, so I can go to the final slide. So instead of answering the questions, I'm suggesting here additional questions. The idea is that as an evaluator, we can try and provide solid, reliable, and credible answer to those that we think are relevant questions. So building a solid framework of analysis can improve the transparency, the credibility, and reliability of the planning exercise. So, what we can do as evaluators is trying to put some flesh over the bones of these crucial questions. This is not yet the answer to how do we know that we are doing the right thing? How can we answer that initial question? This is a list of questions, is not yet a system for quality assurance and review. A system means trying to see how these, first of all, to select the relevant questions, so not all of them may be relevant in all the contexts, and not all of them may be a priority in the context where the selection process takes place. So from a list of questions to a system of evaluation, this is something that requires the policymakers typically to express values and to assess and clearly state which are the policy objectives that need to be achieved. Of course, this is something that the evaluator cannot do. But we are here to assist, and we are happy to help this exercise. 3 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie. Everything's perfect, and thank you for reminding us also on the guidelines you have produced for ICRI, because this is certainly something which we shall remember and return to it back, because as you said, research infrastructures, at least in Europe, are operating in an international environment, but they are somehow rooted nationally, and this complexity creates a lot of issues, and I think we shall and will come to it in the discussion. Thank you also for reminding us that if you want to have relevant answers, you have to ask the proper questions, which sounds trivial, but quite often it's the kernel of the problem. Without continuing this very, very interesting discussion, I would like not only to change the subject, but also the continent. And I am very happy that Sylvie Robinson, coming from Australia, made the effort to join us. Sylvie is responsible for the Australian plant genomics facility, and she has a lot of experience coming from the research and educational sector. So Sylvie, please.
Thanks, Jan. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So we've heard from sort of strategists, policymakers and evaluators. I have spent time in my career in both of those sorts of roles, but these days I'm at the coalface in terms of delivery and service in terms of national research infrastructure, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that from the manager's perspective today. So just by way of introduction, obviously from the accent and the introduction, you'll know I'm coming from Australia, where our National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy, or NCRIS, is the framework under which we operate our national infrastructures. Those infrastructures, there's around 24 of them in Australia. We service both public and private sector users. We have this obviously a large user base in Australia, but we service also a lot of international clients as well. That's delivered across 400 different delivery partnerships with universities and research organisations, and we have a large number of expert operators on whom we rely. My particular facility is the Australian Plant Phenomics facility, which looks at the phenotyping activities to try and really understand what the promise of a genomic potential can give us when it reaches the real world. And so we operate facilities both in terms of highly controlled environments, but also, as you can see from the little montage of photos, out in the field, up in the sky, on the ground, and so forth. Okay, so when people ask me about what it is to be in charge of a research infrastructure and what this means for me on a day-by-day basis, I say, okay, there's really three things that I have to do as a CEO level operator in the infrastructure world. Firstly, my job is about designing successful futures, except they didn't give me a crystal ball, which is a problem. So, you know, in research infrastructure, you're not only thinking about what's the research question that comes next week or next year, you're thinking what and where are the paths and trends of research going so that we can think about how to invest so that we are ready when those folk come to our doors with their interesting questions, maybe not for a few years yet. And so you're really forward casting quite a long way in terms of your thinking. Number two, after you've finished your crystal balling, is you've got to then find the money to make it a reality. So you have to be good at cracking safes, you have to do it legally, so you have to use the only tools you have rather than perhaps this chap here with his little stethoscope and his stealthy hands. Our strategy, maybe that's the same thing as stealthy hands, good relationships and good old-fashioned persistence. And then thirdly, you have to herd cats, and you know, you have your research community, you have your host organisations, you have your key investors, in our case in Australia, a combination of both state and territory governments and federal governments, as well as industry interests. So you really need to be able to build those shared visions and frameworks around which all those parties can coalesce. So, with that in mind, asking today's question around how do we then know, are we investing in the right things, particularly during that investment planning phase. There's three things I'll talk a little bit more about in relation to this. Firstly is the necessity of identifying global trends, but then focusing those down onto your unique national needs. Closely related to that is identifying research and technology frontiers and where those are going. And thirdly is around understanding the return on investment through various economic analyses. So to the global trends first, just some examples from our Australian context. We've just recently had another roadmap released in Australia, and we're now working towards the process of the investment plans that will arise from that. Now, assessing and understanding those global trends was done through a really multifaceted process that ranged from some really quite comprehensive landscape analyses and consultation processes. That some of those were very participative, things like ideas jams, which were online and gave people an opportunity to engage at a time that suited them irrespective of where they were around the world. We had some of those that were, if you like, a closed shop for our existing infrastructures and their operators who are very deeply embedded in the world, and we had some that were open to all comers, public and others, to feed into. a range of consultations that reached out to thousands of people in terms of getting returns around trying to understand needs and trends from right across different sectors. Individual infrastructures were feeding in their own plans and thoughts, decadal plans, white papers and other briefings. Some expert external objective consultants bringing those into stress tests and say, okay, what is this starting to look like? Does it add up coherently? Then, of course, the infrastructures aren't operating in isolation. There's the rest of the Australian innovation ecosystem that you're also looking to try and connect and interface with. So, for example, our Commonwealth Science Industrial Research Organisation, or CSIRO, one of our very large science and technology organisations, has also, been doing similar thinking and has built its strategy around various global megatrends, has released papers on that, has a number of key science missions that they are structuring their investments around. So you have reference points like that, as well as other international roadmaps. In terms of identifying research and technology frontiers, I'm just going to give a couple of examples of work that we did within our own facility on this front as we were building through the process of the roadmap that was recently released and preparing ourselves to put our designs and our decadal plans together. We did what I felt was some quite interesting work in partnership with Claravit Analytics, and we worked with them with their Web of Science data, so all of the data arising from all of the publications that are captured through that Web of Science. And what we were trying to do there was really understand and identify relevant research frontiers and the pace at which they were developing and the extent to which they were firmly located in our domains of interest in terms of plant and agricultural scientists, or whether they were starting to overlap or transition across from other domains. So that was a sort of very data-rich piece of analysis where we looked at highly cited papers against a collection of core terms and words that were important to us. We looked at the stability of their emergence, how long they'd been at the forefront, whether they showed up in parallel against plant and agricultural science, or whether they looked as though it was a new science or a new technology or research direction that was being adopted and pulled across from another domain into agriculture and plant science. It was an incredibly useful exercise to do, and it's been very interesting to see how true the results of those premonitions that were created by that big data, how well they came to pass. The short answer was actually surprisingly well, but I think it's important to mention that it took the expert input to shape it. The data can tell you almost anything you like, especially such large data sets as things like the Web of Science. So you need to be providing some expert input that can help sort through the shaping and the prioritising and how that data is cut. The other thing that proved an interesting challenge within this is unpacking then the specific role of infrastructure within that. It's all well and good to identify research fronts and so forth, but you'll often find that in that sort of data, you aren't necessarily getting the contributions of specific infrastructures or particular technologies very well tagged within that data. So I think there's an awful lot more that we could do systematically in terms of research grant applications, publications, standards and so forth, so that when researchers have used an infrastructure or a piece of technology, it is tagged in a way that then this sort of data analytic work can pull from these large sources of data that we have available to us to start to really show us some rich insights into how infrastructure plays a part there. So we're on that journey, but perhaps not there yet. And then thirdly, it's about understanding the return on investment or economic analysis. And again, within my infrastructure, we've done this a couple of ways, both in a forward-casting type fashion and also some historic analysis. So in terms of our forward-casting, we have now got plans and investment strategies to see us through the decade coming ahead, and we've worked with economic analysts to say, right, across half a dozen key use case areas that we believe we can help solve questions for the research community and industry more broadly. So things like in the domains of protected cropping, crop breeding, vertical farming, the use of plants in medicinal science and so forth, we then looked at, okay, what sorts of research can we support with our plans for the future? How quickly might we expect those to be adopted, at what rate through up into industry or society, and what sort of value within the Australian economic landscape might we be able to expect to derive from that? We've also done some historic analysis. We did that in partnership with a number of other Australian infrastructures, where we looked collectively at the sort of economic spillover benefits that can come from investing into national infrastructures. And so that looked both at sort of direct economic benefits in terms of the immediate activities of those infrastructures, but it also showed quite resoundingly that there's really significant secondary spillover benefits that were, that the base ROI sort of said very conservatively you can easily expect sort of $7 to $10 to every dollar in the broader sense, but that in addition you can get around a threefold return from all of those secondary and tertiary spillover benefits, say from the involvement of technology vendors and others who get involved, and therefore their companies grow and so forth in terms of your GDP return. At a really simple litmus test, certainly for me, is who else is actually willing to invest in what we want to do here, and why. And so that speaks to then your host organisations, what they're trying to achieve both with their research excellence agendas, their research and education agendas, and their participation in local communities as community builders. Certainly the technology vendors are increasingly, that sort of private-public partnership piece is becoming increasingly important, and understanding the value proposition that you represent to those individuals. Going more broadly to industry, our particular infrastructure is one that works very closely with a wide range of the agri-food and plant science industry area, and again, being able to secure genuine cash investment from those folk into your operations is a real demonstration that A, you're serving a need and you've got an immediate relevance. So there's a number of ways in which you can look at who's willing to invest and why. And then perhaps I will just finish talking a little about measuring impact. I know it's something that's been grappled with around the globe in terms of infrastructures, and there's been some really nice pieces of work and frameworks to help support people thinking about that. The impact case study, both in a really detailed sense as well as sort of light touch snapshots, having good KPIs at facility level coupled with good governance is incredibly important. And then, of course, at the national level, we do have a range of data collections on various metrics that get captured at facility level and cascaded up to national level. We do an NCRI census in Australia on a semi-regular basis that then captures and tracks all of that data. So we've got a number of ways in which we're addressing that, but we're not in the position yet at a national level of having a really perfect, coherent system in place yet. So discussion will be really great to hear if there's more thoughts on that. So look, from the perspective of a research infrastructure operator, it's a great honour and a responsibility, because you're not only enabling science and innovation now, but you're shaping what science is actually going to be possible into the future. There's a whole lot of tools and processes at our disposal to inform our investing choices, but it takes a significant time and effort on behalf of administrators like myself to actually bring those to bear and generate the data and the insights from them. And as I mentioned, I think there are still some difficulties in a systemic level for tracking the part that infrastructure plays in amongst all of the other research and innovation components to get us some impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you so much, in particular, for bringing this scientific perspective into the strategic debate, because after all the economic, societal, and other impact research infrastructures have, we shall not forget that they shall provide services to science and broader scientific communities. Thank you for that. And now, colleagues, we are inviting again a speaker from Europe, Massimo Florio, who has a very rich career in academia and broad experience in many disciplines related to today's topic. I am very much interested to hear how he is studying applied welfare economics. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would be happy to present a case study about an existing infrastructure, but this is not what I am going to do now. It will be about an infrastructure that has been proposed, and the question I'm going to ask to you and to myself is, how is it possible to go from the concept of a new research infrastructure, a large-scale one, to the decision? This question arises in the context of a study I have recently concluded for the European Parliament, the Science and Technology panel of the European Parliament, which are the members of Parliament which are interested in science and technology. And they asked me and my team to study the business model of the pharmaceutical sector, including for vaccines, and to study the feasibility of a large-scale European research and development infrastructure for innovation in this area, and to propose alternatives, policy options. We did this with the contribution of 56 top experts within the scientific community, the pharma industry itself, public health experts, and the institutions in an anonymous form. Plus, we studied the literature and so on. The consensus about what I'm going to say is very high, including some controversial, possibly controversial topics, but which in fact are not so controversial in the perspective of the experts. There is the acknowledgement that there is a big disconnection between the agenda, the research agenda of the pharma industry and the health priorities, which is not surprising because pharma companies are not charities. They have to return finance to their investment. Moreover, there is an apparent mismatch between open science as practiced by research infrastructure around the world, and in Europe particularly, and the fact that when downstream innovations are patented, you go exactly in the opposite direction, which is to create monopolies. There are incredibly high returns for investors in this industry. The Government Accountability Office of the United States has calculated that this industry got twice the return than any other industry in the world, with the exception of the tobacco industry. And so on. One example is the fact that there is a lack of comparative clinical studies whether vaccine A is better than vaccine B, just because companies are not interested to fund these comparative studies. They are interested just to fund their own clinical trials, and as a consequence, there are very few independent benefit-cost analysis. The European Commission, after the COVID-19, has proposed some solutions. One has been presented yesterday by Pierre Delzot, who is the General Director of the European Health Emergency Preparedness and Response. However, in my opinion, HERA is not going to be what is needed. A new research infrastructure for medicines and pharma in the public interest. It will be basically a procurement agency for existing pharma, not what is needed looking in the future. So we presented the 4 options to create a very large-scale European biomedical infrastructure. These 4 options are around 2 axes. The first one is whether to focus on infectious diseases only or on a wider range of technologies. And the second one is whether to have a mainly internally based research, intramural, or a more widespread mechanism. And we computed a certain number of financial options going between 3.5 billion per year, which is similar to the National Institutes of Health in the US intramural research program, up to the more than 6.5 billion per year as the European Space Agency. I cite the European Space Agency because that shows that things are possible. You can create a large-scale international infrastructure of this size if there is the political consensus about that. So the reflections and the question is, there is a very high consensus in the community that we would need an alternative to the current way to do research in this area. Yesterday there was a presentation by a vice president of Johnson & Johnson, and she emphasized the need of a public-private partnership. Well, here the issue is having first an infrastructure in the public perspective, and then open it to the participation of companies. The problem here is that to build this kind of very large-scale infrastructure based on a model such as the European Space Agency or the CERN or the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, in the European context, you need to put together the European Parliament. Very recently, there was a workshop at the European Parliament where I presented these ideas with the participation of 3 different DGs of the Commission. You need the member states represented by the European Council and the different ministries, but critically important, you need the scientific communities, the public health authorities, the medical profession, and the patients associations, and possibly you need to have the pharma industry not taking an adversarial attitude, but understand that that would be an opportunity for them as well, even if in a completely different position as compared with the current system. The current system, to collapse it in one figure, is up to December 21, the European Commission spent 71 billion euros to buy vaccines from the companies, with a profit margin that for some vaccines, particularly for the mRNA, for the messenger RNA vaccine, is probably around 90%, with around 20 euros per dose, against a production cost of $2 per dose. So please compare the budget of so many research infrastructures in Europe and in the world with the profits that the taxpayers have insured to mainly US companies within these 71 billions in just less than 2 years. And I am not counting what is going to happen this year with the variants and with the announcements by some of the companies that are going to double the price of each dose. So in terms of reflections for the decision making, let me give you the example of what is going on in the United States, which, by the way, are not very represented in this conference, right? Well, for biomedical research, the National Institutes of Health, which respond directly to their Ministry of Health, have a yearly budget of around 43 billion per year in 27 institutes and centers and so on. The Fauci Institute for allergies and infectious disease alone has a budget of more than 6 billion. This is going to be combined with BARDA, which has another federal institution with a budget of 2.6 as a regular budget, but that for the development of the vaccines increased to 18 billion in 6 months to provide support to research. So the question is, in some cases, the best minds within research infrastructures are dealing with thinking ways to put together scientists and so on. But probably what we need to fix before is the government infrastructure. The decision process is too complex, is broken. And the fact that in the United States they have a federal government that is able to take decisions, meaning that it is not necessary that Texas and Kentucky and Ohio negotiate between them in order to put together the research infrastructure. But at a certain point, there is a federal institution that is able to provide this money. Let me give you, well, this is an aerial view of the Bethesda campus with its 75 buildings. But in these buildings, under one roof, or several roofs, there are 1,200 principal investigators. And the grants by the NIH support tens of thousands other principal investigators. So in some cases, the issue of going from the concept to consensus, it is very much an issue of institutional and policy failures. So I will go ahead with this project. It is going now to be examined by 3 different committees of the European Parliament. I met the cabinets of 2 different commissioners at the European Commission level, but my time is finished now, even if I can forecast that I will need a lot of time to convince the different holders of the decision process to go ahead with these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo, for sharing with us your vision and indicating also many challenges ahead of us. Colleagues, time's progressing very fast, but as you see, the issue we have chosen for our discussion panel is very broad and can be tackled from many perspectives. Therefore, it's great pleasure for me to invite now Daniel to the stage, because Daniel, in his position in the South African agency in the Department of Science and Technology, is somehow covering all the issues that have been discussed today, because he is responsible for many things, for monitoring of research infrastructures, for evaluation of research infrastructures, for developing strategies on research infrastructures, and even for financial issues. So Daniel, we are looking very much forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and good afternoon, colleagues, and to the organizers for the invitation to here. Maybe my portfolio is not so broad as you indicated, but yes, I'll try my best to give a perspective. In line with the topic of, and the theme of this session here, building quality assurance review into investment and the selection process, I would like to just give a short South African perspective on that, and by means of a few general comments or inputs, and then looking at the, as a case study or an example, the South Africa Research Infrastructure Roadmap. So, I mean, I think to start is to also just in the context of the thematic area of this session here is to say that in the case of South Africa, our impact is framed or derived from, derived from investment in research infrastructure and founded on a two-component value proposition. The one is the local proposition, which is about the impact of socioeconomic value to the country. A huge emphasis on research and human capital development, as well as mission-driven innovation and technology development. On the other side, the question is now, why are people interested in South Africa or collaborating with South Africa, or South Africa collaborating with international partners? Is, again, that global value proposition in terms of the resources that we have in the country available to collaborate, but also the demographic dividend that we bring to the table, as well as the geographical advantage to that, and then that put us in a position to really to participate and collaborate within the global context. The question is around the insurance, quality insurance. The first basic step for us is to start with the needs compared to the want, because we know that sometimes the wants lead to more disastrous decisions in that. And then there must be a matrix of what you expect to get from this investment that you make. And once that is in place, it's obviously the quality control management system, or the quality management system, as well as the controls to verify that you've done or made the correct decisions. Another important thing for us is that the quality insurance must be built in or embedded in each step of or stage of the full life cycle of a research infrastructure. Then also the quality insurance must be important in shaping and influencing the outcomes of your indicators, or what you want to achieve on that. So along the different things, and you can tie it back to our value proposition in terms of what we see as key outcomes or indicators, and that need to be influenced and shaped by the quality insurance that you build into the system. So, using this as this background, or that as our sort of terms of reference, we developed then also a case study here. I would like to present how we use that in order to go about in establishing 11 out of the 13 infrastructure on our current research infrastructure roadmaps. And it was, started off with a very broad, consultation process in the form of a South Africa EU dialogue, just to, I think, as probably Susie also indicated, that in terms of seeing what are the global trends that we want to lock and to get alignment around that. And that then, with that framework, then helped us to bring it down into a local context and to say what are the things that we need now. And broad-based consultation was key to that. As well as we realized if we don't have a champion in this process, somebody that's passionate around driving that, you're not going to get anywhere. And then obviously the decision-making process. And after you've done now this consultation processes, there was this agreed criteria in terms of selection of this infrastructure. And we have done it at two levels, basically. The first one is to put criteria down for the science and the business case. And these were the key criteria that we put in place for the science and the business case in terms of impact, scientific excellence, financials, and up to evaluation and monitoring. But once that has been done and there's a proposal on the table, it needs to come to a point where you do the applied criteria in terms of affordability, and is it aligned with national priorities. And then we as a government then say, yes, from the scientists and the scientific community, here's a proposal now. Is it affordable to the country? Can we not just afford it now, but it should be long-termly sustainable in terms of funding support? Is it in alignment with our national priorities? And again, the impact, is it what we expect? And this is just an example, a quick example, how one of the RIs, the distributed platform for omics, articulated their quality assurance in their quality services, and you can read how they went about to the end that they want to be sustainable in their development of that. And by adopting that quality assurance approach now, they put themselves in a position when during the COVID pandemic outbreak now, they were in a position to respond in helping the country in the different aspects of the COVID, in terms of the testing, in terms of the surveillance, and so forth. The other example I just quickly want to flip here is now one of the other research infrastructure roadmaps that we invested in here. Again, in terms of, you can see very complicated governance structure, but the one I want to draw your attention to is the one in a circle, where they actually, on top of a scientific advisory board or steering structure, they also put in place a community advisory structure, so that when the scientists come with the science projects now, it's subjected to a community steering to say, but we on the ground experience it differently, or yes, it will work in that now. So again, to have that sort of social license to operate and know now what you put in place is going to work because it's carrying the support of the community. And again, because of that approach and that building in that quality insurance and loops into the system, again, during the COVID pandemic now, this is a social humanities and social infrastructure now here for population studies now here. They could embark on, for example, determining the uptake and the willingness for people to be vaccinated. But again, they have that license to operate, and therefore they could conduct these kind of studies. So in conclusion now, I would like to just to say that for us, quality insurance is central and critical to ensure impactful outcomes on investment in infrastructure. That quality insurance mechanism and criteria were built in the selection of the infrastructures, the process that we followed during the conceptualization, during the formulation and putting together of these different proposals up to the point where they've been selected. And these different mechanisms that we put in, or criteria, upfront requirements, put in a good governance. And I think it resonates with what the other colleagues have referred to. Advisory structures, steering management structures must be put in place in order to have, to do that quality assurance, but also to assist, ensure a long-term sustainability. And then what we do as an ongoing sort of quality assurance is that once these infrastructures have been established, we have regular, at least biannually, meetings with the managers and of these infrastructures to do ongoing checks and evaluation of where you are on that trajectory of implementing that infrastructure. And also, recently we started in 2016, and the first 7 projects has been now 5 years into the making. And so we agreed that we don't want to do a deep dive review at this point in time, but just evaluation again to check if the originally set criteria and requirements are still in place and has been met now in terms of going forward. So we just concluded that particular study, and when I go back, I have to look at the reports in how we're faring on that, so that we can correct in going forward, and the ones that still need to be evaluated, that we can also make that necessary corrections in that regard. And by having that robust system that we put into place, we can with confidence say that most of the RIs, or all the RIs that we put in place, have demonstrated significant impact and relevance, as I've indicated, the 2 examples that we cited here in terms of really immediate impact in critical situations like during the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. So with that, I'd like to, I think it's my last slide, and I would like to say thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much indeed. In particular, I'm very thankful that you have been very strict on yourself, and you gave us few more minutes for the discussion. So colleagues, I invite you all to the stage now, and we have a complicated issue to solve because we have only 17 minutes according to my dive computer, and we have plenty of questions I have prepared, and I'm quite sure that also some questions arise here from the audience, and in top of that I have been given such a device to be able to look whether some questions appear from the audience that is following us remotely. So here in the room, whenever you have a question, just make your recognizable, raise your hand. I will hope that I will see you, and I will hope also that somebody brings you the microphone so you can pose the question. Thank you, microphones are in the back. Also the colleagues following us remotely, I will or shall be able with this device be able to follow whether there is some questions. And from the questions I have prepared, it's absolutely unrealistic that I will ask most of them. So let's try to group that, because there were some patterns to recognize in your presentations, and I will try to rephrase the questions such that you can take them up and try to find responses to it. So one thing that became very apparent in all your contributions, even so you started from different perspectives, is that one has to make a kind of trade-off between scientific excellence, between societal needs, between, let's say, the capacity of the system to support the research infrastructure. So is there a kind of ratio? Is there a priority? Would you rank scientific excellence above any other criteria, or what is the merger? What is the trade-off you would propose? There are some microphones there, and I can serve with this microphone from my end. So whoever would like to start. Sorry for not being so concrete, but I think the question is more or less clear. Is there a pattern when taking political, policy-driven decision to serve the society and science at the same time?
I'll have a bit of a go at this. I certainly think that there are tensions when you're trying to serve and be valuable to so many different types of potential beneficiaries. And if I think about our own experience in my national infrastructure, as I mentioned, we service industry as well as the publicly funded academic research community. I think I would say with confidence that the research excellence thing has to sit as the #1 priority that sits above all else. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, it's what matters at the heart of publicly funded research, and indeed, scientific and research endeavour is to be striving for that. And that's easy to say, but incredibly fundamentally important to why everyone's probably in the room, because they're passionate about that. But secondly, I think then if you take that framework, it also then leads you to make sure that the work that you're doing for others, whether it's industry or others, is not becoming something that is in competition with or in duplication of what they might be able to achieve for themselves. Because you often find through your engagement, certainly we do with our engagement with the various industry players, that to some extent they can take a research and development journey to a certain point, but beyond that they need to go and find absolute par excellence experts, and if you like, there's a market failure in the way in which they can themselves afford to address that. And so I think one of the powers of investing in research infrastructure is making those careful choices to make sure you're not doing anything that's in competition or unnecessarily duplicative with what they could do, but fills a market failure where it exists. And if it does that, as well as supports research excellence, then I think you have a really great outcome.
Thank you. Anybody of you colleagues? Please. Go ahead.
Thank you. For me, there's some reciprocity and dependence on, in that question now, because first of all, research infrastructures, is a means to an end. Cannot be a means in itself, and therefore it needs to enable you to do certain things. And in a country like South Africa, human capital development, or people, I mean, is very key to the investment, what we're doing, I think, in most of the types of investment we make in the country, including investment in research infrastructure. Because if we can build a good cohort of people, well-skilled people now, that, for me, the excellence in the science will come as a consequence of that. So I think, I mean, can fairly confident that there's probably a skewness in South Africa in terms of, I mean, that whatever you do now here, the investment in the people is the priority in that, because that will unlock for the other things, I mean, such as, I mean, quality or in excellence in research, as well as the addressing then the socioeconomic problems, because it's about job creation, it's about quality of life for people in that, if they have the necessary skills.
Thank you. Probably I should take the micro that the colleagues who are following us remotely also hear something. Let me then a little bit reshape the question and just looking to Alasdair and Sylvia. When then considering this impact, and I mean, I could not but agree that science is very important and the human perspective, of course, but the service, let's say, to society, the economic impact, the regional impact, when you're assessing this in forefront of the planning or developing a local, regional, national strategy, do you consider research and human resources development somewhere in your criteria, and how high are they ranked? Maybe, Sylvia.
Yeah, I'm not sure I got your question. On the point on the trade-offs, yes, of course, as evaluator, we came constantly in a face of existing trade-off. So our role is more to point out that there may be possible trade-off. As external, as independent experts, we shall stay away from saying, I mean, which are the priorities, not us. It's the policy context that should tell what is the priority in that very specific. Let me give you an example. A typical trade-off, if we refer precisely in terms of economic impact, but also scientific impact, there's a clear trade-off between global excellence and local impact. So you may fund different types of infrastructure. You may benefit many different types of beneficiary if you go for one priority or the other. So this trade-off came up in a recent evaluation, ex-post evaluation that we have done of the ERDF programs that were funded in the 2007-2013 period by the EU cohesion policy. That is a policy that supports the reduction of regional disparities, which means that they have to benefit the less developed regions against the most advanced one. Now, if you take this perspective, global excellence, funding scientific excellence at the global level may be something that you have to put a little bit apart, because the priority changes. So if you think about, for example, this problem, this challenge for the policymaker was quite clear, for example, in the case of the Czech Republic, which was different eligibility criteria in that period for the Prague region and the other regions. So most of the funds were concentrated in the less developed region, but most of the scientific capacity was in the Prague region. And that was a challenge for the policymakers, because they have to face this trade-off. So in the specific context of the EU cohesion policy, which has the priority of reducing regional disparity, then the priority is the local effect, or the capacity to facilitate a local impact. It's different in the context of the EU research policy, for example, which takes a completely different perspective. So it really depends on the institutional and policy context, and what we can do as evaluator, we can show if there are possible trade-offs. We cannot solve ourselves the trade-off.
Aster,
Yeah.
advising policymakers
Yeah,
who can develop strategies, or at least advise on developing strategies.
I'm not sure the word trade-off's right, so yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure I disagree with Sylvia, but maybe just to get a debate going, but I mean, I think, you know, I think when we're investing, the first and real criteria is, are we creating excellence? And that can be excellence in terms of the scientific research, but also the industrial support or the societal support. And so, you know, if you're investing in a research infrastructure, that has to be the key criteria. And I think what, again, just something that came up in the Greek case that I presented was, people said to us, having the equipment is great, having the brains around it that can advise us, even if we're either research teams from another university or industrial people, you know, doing a test on a piece of equipment is great, but getting advice on how to do that test and having that expertise is critical. So I think people are looking for the best capacity possible. And I think there, if you're investing, to take up Sylvia's case, in less advanced regions and putting in infrastructure that's subcritical, doesn't meet those excellence criteria, then I don't think you're doing anyone a favor. So I think that's maybe where there is a trade-off. You shouldn't be doing that sort of trade-off. You shouldn't be saying we're trying to support local development by installing something in a region which is not actually going to have that excellence level. So yeah, I mean, and I think the other aspect that comes through, and I very much like Daniel's presentation, and the fact that you have to have that quality view at each point in the policy cycle and understand, and also in the research infrastructure life cycle, in terms of how are we actually making that progress over time. So you may not start with the top quality, but you have to aspire to that. So I think that's something which we have to build into the process. And it's not just about maybe getting some numbers out at the end that you can, you know, the sort of impact assessments that say, or the cost-benefit assessments say you've got a ratio of X or Y. It's also about being able to show progress over time to actually meeting those excellent standards. So I think that sort of evaluative sort of framework would be very useful for assessing progress over time rather than just a number at some stage in time.
Thank you. Massimo, I don't want to exclude you from this question, so you still can react on it, but I have prepared for you a bit specific thing, because also your presentation was a little bit out of the let's say, very general context. So you have been proposing a very new type of research infrastructure, by far different from a traditional understanding of research infrastructures as we are used to. I mean, probably even globally, because we have discovered many similarities across the globe. So I'm just wondering, why do you think this new type of research infrastructure is needed, and why we cannot go for a kind of global enterprise and just a little bit more develop on the business concept there? Why shall we go from the, let's say, the public perspective, which is, as you realized and rightly mentioned, quite painful?
Thank you. But I wouldn't escape for the first question, because my answer to the first question, trade-off between excellence in science and the other benefits, is something on which I have written a book, which is, I suggest you to immediately buy it and read it, which is Investing in Science, the Social Cost-Benefit Analysis of Research Infrastructure. And my answer in that book is that you should not try to combine the issue of scientific excellence with the other social benefits. It is dichotomic. Either scientific excellence is there, 0, 1. If it is 1, go ahead with the rest. If there is no perspective of scientific excellence, it is completely nonsensical to go ahead and look for regional development impacts and so on. So my suggestion is, every time, everywhere, scientific excellence, not just first, but absolute part of the ethos of scientific research. Without that, it is completely unhelpful to go on and study the other benefits. As for your specific question, the issue here is how to create a global public good, potentially a global public good, for instance, creating open knowledge for vaccines against any kind of future coronavirus. I mention coronavirus because we know since 20 years, it was absolutely expected since 20 years that RNA coronavirus would be focal in zoonosis episodes. As you know, the name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2 because there was a SARS-CoV-1, and this was nearly 20 years before. So the issue is we need to create the knowledge for a global public good. So why not to think to a global research infrastructure? This is exactly the message that I tried to do. You cannot think to a research infrastructure without thinking to the institutional environment. So we need a global public good about climate change adaptation, but have been ever successful in putting together conferences of 200 states and getting a consensus about that? The answer is no. So ideally, we would like to have a global infrastructure for future pandemics, but practically, in my opinion, we should start in Europe with the understanding that Europe should be prepared to be the key player of this new game and to donate to the rest of the world the knowledge. So another way to think a global research infrastructure is that you do what you can where you are, and then you donate globally, and you involve scientists from everywhere in the world to do what you do.
Thank you. By that you have partially replied to a question which came in the web from Katarina Biscari. She was asking whether you could be more concrete at which stage you are on the long way to go. And I understand the question also in that sense, how can the existing research infrastructures that are already present in Europe be integrated in that? But I kindly ask you for a very short answer because our time is already over and I would like to give the colleagues a chance.
30 seconds. We are at the stage where members of the European Parliament in different committees are looking at the proposals, and they are doing their job, which is going ahead with consensus building, which is not my job. I am a researcher. There are people paid by the taxpayer to build consensus about that. So the European Parliament is going to consider that. The European Commission is informed. Sorry? Thank you. Okay, and thank you. One second on the other question. Yes, I think that the existing research infrastructure should be part of the project. For instance, it is obvious that we do not need to build another synchrotron light source. We can capitalize on that and put this in the critical mass.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'm terribly sorry for the bad time management from my side, but our time is really over. But still, I would like to use the inspiration developed today or yesterday even by the colleagues, and I would like to give you a chance for one sentence or few words, just passing over the message to the audience on how do we know that we are investing in the right things. Let's start maybe from this end.
If you're attracting talent to your research infrastructure.
If you end up with stories that make sense.
Investment in research infrastructure must result in quality and skilled people that can drive the research agenda and then eventually contribute to socioeconomic impact in that region and the country. Thank you.
You've been very effective in this motto game. I would say very good. I would say that we know that we're investing in the right thing if we have a solid and transparent way of showing why, what are the reasons that underpin the choice that we are making.
Okay, colleagues, I'm very sorry, but we are running out of time. I am closing this panel with a big thank to all of you for your contributions, and I hope that also the audience has taken a lot from your presentations. Thank you very much indeed.